Welcome to another Wisdom Pod. We have Keoki Jackson with us. Keoki is Senior Vice President and General Manager at Mitrate National Security. He spent previously 23 years at Lockheed Martin, which is a lot. Studied, he was a NASA graduate research fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, studied at Stanford as well, and got a PhD at MIT as well. So quite the accomplished individual. Today, we're going to talk about security, mostly today, technology, and everything between. This podcast is presented to you by podpire.com. If you want to start or scale a podcast, go to podpire.com. Kyoki, glad to have you on. Can you tell me a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays?
Yeah, first of all, I'm at the MITRE Corporation. I've been here just over 3 years, and I lead the national security sector here. So the general manager for all of our work for the Department of Defense in the intelligence community. But interestingly, I actually started my professional career at MITRE over 30 years ago as an intern after my sophomore year in college, and maybe I'll come back to that. So I came full circle, came home just a few years ago. What we focus on here, really solving some of the most challenging integrated systems problems that the Department of Defense faces, thinking about things like all domain command and control across all of the services, or the kinds of work that's needed to ensure the capabilities within the communications command and control systems for our nuclear strategic deterrent for the nation. So those are the kinds of challenges we tackle. We're also tackling everything, from what is the future of intelligence in a world of open source, commercial, publicly available information and ubiquitous surveillance, to how do you handle law enforcement, particularly against transnational criminal organizations in a world of the dark web and cryptocurrencies and criminal organizations that really transcend boundaries and even nation states. So those are the kinds of things that we worry about here.
Very important stuff. What did you learn from your 23 years at Lockheed Martin about the market, about how to manage technology in a big organization? Tell us about the main lessons from your time there.
Yeah, I had the great fortune at Lockheed to start as a junior engineer and left as a fairly senior executive, having served as chief technology officer at the corporate level, but also run organizations like I stood up the corporate supply chain organization. I had the chief information officer organization under me. And ran things like program management, program performance at the corporate level. So I had an opportunity to really see quite the breadth of the operations and technology of the company. And a couple of things really struck me. The first is, the importance of always tying, technology to business, right? And so at the end of the day, really deeply understanding what the business and the business strategy is, the organization, tying that back to what your technology strategy should be. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. We early on in my tenure as CTO, our CEO said, "Hey, I'd like you to really take a hard look and come up with a technology strategy for the organization." And if you think about a large company it's a multi-sector company, so everything from airplanes to spacecraft to mission systems on ships and undersea systems to building, rockets and munitions. So very diverse portfolio of work, including a lot of very sophisticated information technology systems for the Department of Defense. And each of those businesses is investing in technology. And so being able to take a step back and say, okay, what are the things that are going to be most important for the future? Not thinking 1 or 2 years or 3 years from now, which is typically in the individual businesses, but where are we in artificial intelligence or quantum technologies or hypersonics? And so at that time, several years ago, we picked a set of big bets that we were going to focus on that were cross-cutting across the organization, and ultimately invested in those and created the opportunity for significant new business across the sectors, not just within a single part of the organization. So really taking that enterprise view. The second was really bringing the people into the process. And so you can think about, I got a lot of technologists. Are we connecting with the strategy folks? Are we bringing the human resources team in to understand what talent we're going to need if we're actually going to execute these technology and business strategies? And then working down in the organization, oftentimes with people who are closest to the action, if you will, to understand what they're sensing with their customers and how we could bring that into the strategy. And at the same time, having the people then bring the strategy back to the organization, because the worst, I say, one of the worst things that can happen is you come up with a brilliant strategy and the organization is not on board, and then you can't execute the strategy and it sits on a shelf gathering dust.
Seems to me that organizations like Lockheed Martin have become so big and convoluted that they're not able to operate and deliver at the levels that the national security of the US requires it. And it seems to me that startups such as Anduril, started by Palmer Luckey, really came into the rescue of national security, and Palantir, for example. Do you agree with that statement?
I'd have to say, no, I don't really agree with that statement. And this is not a dig on any of the organizations. I think it's really a reflection of the kinds of problems that are being solved. And so there's a certain set of, highly complex integrated problems that require very deep, production, manufacturing, other expertise. And you have an ecosystem with companies like Lockheed Martin. These are great companies that have gotten very good at doing those kinds of things. But I think also sometimes it's challenging for an organization to reinvent itself, and all of these companies are working to do that. It always helps if there's somebody coming in kind of from the outside and creating a sense of urgency and a sense of competition. And what I see is that you see companies like Anduril, for example, that have really grown up in what I'd call, that they are digital companies first and foremost, and then transforming that digital to the physical world. And that has created both a sense of urgency that reflects what the Department of Defense needs. So a lot of times, it's not necessarily, hey, we need a new ship or a new airplane, but we need these to work together in new ways. They need to integrate data from a whole bunch of sensors across different platforms. They need to be able to select, what weapon, for example, you might use against a specific threat across the entire set of military services. And so these are now areas where I think new competitors have come in with some new ideas. But I will also say that they don't get a free pass on the things that are really important. So if you think about how mission critical safety of life, a lot of times companies come in and they say, hey, we've got a great idea, great technology, but they ignore a lot of what we call the mil PF, right? So the doctrine and the operations, the concepts of operations, the logistics, the sustainment. And so I think, what we're seeing is now some of these other companies are really trying to understand what is the whole dimension of life cycle that they need to think about. And frankly, that adds to some of the complexity and challenges that they're finding in moving into broader mission spaces. And maybe I'll just wrap up here. This is one of the things that I came back to MITRE because of exactly those kinds of challenges. The challenge of taking high technology, especially digital technology and information technology, and translating that into actual mission outcomes. And MITRE is a really unique place because of and maybe I'll get a little bit more into what is a federally funded research and development center and how does MITRE operate those and why. But we have the opportunity to work problems truly at a system of systems level. And so we can operate across different contractors who maybe bring pieces of the puzzle, an airplane or a control system or a weapon, and work across those different contractors, and also work to integrate across different parts of the government that are recognizing they need to collaborate, communicate, and interoperate in different ways.
Right. Before we get to my trade, want to talk about the current state of the world when it comes to war and foreign policies, and just what's cooking on this planet. I have a map right under my eyes. It's actually my mouse pad, and have a look at China there. studied China. China's an economic power. I think they're pretty smart in trying to get economic partners throughout the world, sort of disrupting the Monroe Doctrine in South and Central America. But I don't view them as pit bulls. They're sort of they don't have that much of a history of invading. They have an history of being invaded by Japan and so forth. But then I look at Russia, and they don't have the economic power. They're weakened, but they are little pit bulls, and they're trying to make their rule out there. So, what is your current view of the world, and where are you seeing threats on a foreign policy level? Did that got in, or are we still connected?
Charles, we may have lost you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, yeah. I think we're back. No, it's the connections in the red, and your image is still frozen.
Sure. Can you see if it's a really interesting and complex landscape, and we got to remind ourselves, there's something like 120 different conflicts going on around the globe, and so it's not maybe just the ones that often occupy our attention, like Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, like what's happening in Gaza today, or honestly, what's happening in places like the Philippines with aggression against some of the regions in the Philippine and South China Seas. So we need to always consider that it is a broader landscape than we often think about. And we need to worry about the global security and the ability for some of these, as we saw in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, to go from regional or local problems into global issues. So with that perspective, I think first of all, there's sort of these acute aggressions like you see in Russia attacking Ukraine, but we should not fool ourselves that there isn't, a longer term but equally important series of aggression going on with players like China. And so China is very much, I'd say, a revanchist communist state. They are, not only, not in favor of today's rules-based international order, but are actively looking to reshape that international order to more of a might is right kind of a philosophy. And they are, while we may not see it in, bombs and missiles, we're absolutely seeing the preparations. So, for example, the massive increase in China's nuclear capability, nuclear weapon capability and infrastructure just over the last few years, their deployment of hypersonic weapons, and what I would call an ongoing hot war in the cyber world today. So we need to recognize that there is a real and serious threat, and it only continues to grow over time. The other thing we need to recognize is the economic dimension that goes along with the military dimension, and the fact that China has looked at really being dominant in critical economic sectors and industrial areas in the next few years, to include things like clean energy, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, and more. So now what do we do about it? And obviously we need to maintain what I call the cornerstones of our strategic deterrence, and that's important. So our nuclear triad, our nuclear command and control, and everything that wraps around that. But we need to be thinking about deterrence in a much more integrated way that bridges the diplomatic, the informational, the economic, as well as the military. And so that leads us to things like strategic economics as an opportunity to create deterrent mechanisms. When you think about what, in the United States, you have many different departments and agencies that manage things like tariffs, for example, sanctions, export controls, treasury controls and financial instruments. And so now saying, what can we do to coordinate and exercise, integrated approaches across all of those spaces to achieve the deterrent effects that we hope. And the goal here is not to, keep other nations down, but really to preserve an international order that is rules-based, that does comport with the rule of law, that recognizes human rights, the value of democratic systems and principles. So that's ultimately the end goal. But we do need to think about deterrence in a much broader way.
What is the role of NATO into all of this?
NATO has really created a strategic umbrella that has, with ups and downs, kept, I'd say, Western Europe and increasingly countries more on the eastern side, integrated with a view of combined deterrence and collective defense that has kept the peace for a long, long time, since World War II. And it's important to point out that there have been some very important successes for NATO. If we think about bringing down the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, that was, it was an important victory. Certainly, it wasn't the end of the story as we know today. And we also need to remind ourselves that the only time that NATO has actually invoked Article 5 of collective defense was in the aid of the United States after the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001. And so it was really interesting to me as I was recently out at NATO headquarters in Brussels and walked in, and there's two memorials, one, the Berlin Wall on one side, and then on the other side, some twisted beams from one of the towers at the World Trade Center. And you think about that history, it's incredible. And then you go to the other side of the building, and now the raising of two new flags with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance. I think it really does require us to ask the question, what do we think that future of NATO will be? What are the required contributions from each of the nations? But we also need to think about it in terms, again, of integration. And this is where a company like MITRE really comes in, because as we see, each nation, individually doing what they can does not add up to a collective deterrent or a collective security strategy. And so increasingly, we are focused on not just interoperability, but interchangeability. So the company or the countries being able to fight together, without really seamlessly. So the command and control systems, the communication systems, the ability to task one organization from another organization. These are the kinds of things that are going to make NATO really formidable in the future. The other thing is innovation. And, the West, I'd say the United States, to be sure, has been successful in maintaining the peace because of technology and because of being able to bring technology, whether it's, into space, into stealth, precision guided weapons, global positioning system, or GPS. These have become the, kind of the table stakes of modern warfare. And that technology frontier is always moving. So the things that we're focused on are capabilities or organizations like NATO Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which is now bringing innovation investments, testing, startup companies, investment in integration of technologies into mission applications, bringing all of these things together to accelerate innovation across the alliance. And that's a very different way to think about NATO than we might have thought about just military capabilities a few years ago.
With terrorist attacks occurring, how can we prevent these? And how should one respond to being attacked and having hundreds, if not thousands, of their citizens murdered by terrorists?
This is again, I go back to those 100+ conflicts around the globe, and many of those are essentially involving terrorist organizations or terrorist organizations funded by nation states. So while we think about global strategic competition and competition with nations like China or Russia, we can never forget that terrorism did not go away with the United States leaving Afghanistan, for example. So this is going to continue to be a challenge for all of us. I think there's many things, and again, that integrated approach is really important. You do have to deter, not just through denial, but sometimes essentially by punishment, right? Is one of the theses of denial of deterrence. And so not responding often just invites greater and more, oftentimes far worse aggression. At the same time, we need to think about addressing some of the root causes behind what drives this. And I think that's where, you really think about that again, integrated approach that includes working across nations, working with allies and partners, working on the diplomatic front to get after some of these really complex challenges. But I'd also say, this is a critical role for many organizations in intelligence and law enforcement. And so, in the United States, we, want to make sure that we are catching the bad folks, if you will, but also making sure that we respect our laws, respect our privacy of our citizens, and are making sure that all of those elements are considered as we tackle very thorny national security problems.
I always had questions regarding privacy, like why should I care about my privacy if I don't have anything to hide?
Mhm. That's a philosophical question in a lot of ways. I think there's evidence over time that organizations tend to overreach, and oftentimes what people do with information may not be originally what was intended. I'll leave it at that.
Right. And I mean, if you're in a communist regimen and if you don't agree with your leaders and what they will do with that information, yeah, that certainly warrants for privacy. I heard you talk many times about AI, fervent believer in AI. I do think that some individuals, they should get flagged for the content that they put online. They should attract the attention of agencies, quote unquote, so that they can be monitored, especially if they're gonna do crazy things. Now, these organizations, as I started this interview, I'm not so much worried about Lockheed as I am with Palantir and Anduril. I do think that AI can scale so much faster. I think AI can be overbearing. How do we make sure that these organizations are kept in check and do not wage wars for profit or abuse of these very powerful technologies that they're creating?
Let me just say on artificial intelligence, this is all technologies are, the impact rests on how they are used. And, it's hard to identify technology that can't be used for good or evil, right? And I'd say AI is no different. Our focus here at MITRE has been really on the elements that allow you to develop assured artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence that can be trusted, that you can demonstrate is free from certain kinds of harmful bias. Artificial intelligence that stays within certain guardrails as defined by the application of the mission needs. And so, our view is, there's such incredible opportunity to do good with artificial intelligence, to improve the economic prospects of billions of people, to improve the way government functions in healthcare and transportation, in law enforcement, all of these areas. And so the important thing is to allow the innovation in these areas of opportunity while making sure that you have the assurance, the trust, the guardrails in place so that you don't have, evil consequences as a result.
Another spicy question here. Many would argue that foreign powers are trying to mess up democracy in the US elections. I think they were successful with Trump um, electing actors that can shake up things in the wrong directions and even potentially cause civil wars and civil unrest, as we've seen with the attacks on the Capitol. How do you make sure that the country doesn't destroy itself from its own internal ranks?
Yeah, first on the premise of the question, look, we know that there has been significant attempts to interfere with elections around the world, driven by, it's countries like Russia, China, and Iran, and so we should not disregard that. I think, it's there's a lot of open questions as to how much success any of these countries have had. I do think of national security as broader than just, say military or strategic deterrence. And I do think that national security, there's an important element of protecting our democratic institutions and making sure that they continue to survive and thrive into the future. So I do think that's an important concept in national security. But that also goes along with other national security elements. We need to worry about global threats like climate change or pandemic. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's not just national security, but international security. So working with like-minded nations, to come back to where you started, to emphasize the importance of democratic values, of market economies and market principles, of international rules-based strategies, including reliance on the rule of law. And so I think continuing to emphasize the things that matter the most to us and that are most important to our citizens is critically important.
Tell me about these last two, global warming and pandemics. How is MITRE intervening and potentially coming with solutions to these two?
Yeah, it really is a great question. I'll give you maybe just two examples here. On the pandemic side, one of MITRE's great virtues, because we are a not-for-profit organization, but we have roughly 8,000 scientists, technologists, and engineers at our disposal to really tackle significant integrated challenges. We're able to bring together not just the different elements of a problem, but bring together in new ways other organizations. It could be government organizations across the government. So think about in the United States, the oceans you might have. The Defense Department is interested from a DoD perspective. But the Department of Commerce and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, is concerned about everything from fisheries and rising sea temperatures to the future of the Atlantic right whale, for example. So MITRE is uniquely positioned to be able to bring together organizations across government, industry, academia, and nonprofits to tackle problems in new ways. An example on that, on the pandemic front, at the height of the pandemic, MITRE created what was called the COVID Coalition, and we brought together literally hundreds of organizations to tackle different elements of the problem. And that was something that we were able to both advance solutions, but also kind of create that dialogue around what was going to be needed for the future, not just for this pandemic, but potentially future pandemics. So that's one example. On the climate side, we have seen a couple of examples recently. You've got the Panama Canal is significantly down in their have been metering ships through because of the drought there. So we're starting to see the impacts of climate in different places. And where a company like MITRE makes a huge difference, we're actually able to bring together different parts of the organization, or different organizations, whether private sector, public sector, and government, to look at systems kinds of solutions there. So not just I'll just use the example of resilient transportation, for example. So being able to look not at just one mode of transportation, but across the entire system, looking at the choke points, the critical points, single point failures, if you will, whether they're bridges or ports or airports, and really understand if you're going to invest in resiliency, and particularly resiliency in a changing climatic world, where are the places that you would invest first?
Good question. I'm curious as well, like this, the direction that MITRE is taking, how is it different than DARPA's, which we all know about?
Yeah, DARPA is, first of all, it's an amazing organization, and MITRE actually does support DARPA in a variety of different ways. So it's a place that's very important to the United States, and certainly important to MITRE. You should think of MITRE again as a systems engineering company that tackles, that is able to take many different interesting and hard technologies and bring them together to solve mission impacts. And so if you think about deterrence in the Indo-Pacific and the challenges that our Indo-PACOM commander faces out there, MITRE is not looking at a particular sensor or a particular platform, but really how does all of that work together? So that's one critical thing about MITRE. The other thing, DARPA is a little bit of an innovation engine in the sense of, every 3 years it's a completely new cast. MITRE has that depth and continuity of experience, 65 years in the deterrence business, 65 years of putting advanced technology against problems from, solving the global war on terror and dealing with what's happening in NATO today, but also solving major problems, including like bending the cost of healthcare in the United States, or figuring out how to continue to drive down the number of aviation incidents in a already very safe aviation system. So those are the kinds of problems that MITRE can get at because we are looking at that systems view.
Right. And uh, pretty much last question here. When it comes to your objectives this year at MITRE, what would be your top three in terms of accomplishments that you want to have done by the end of this year?
You know what? I'm just going to go with one. And, all of these challenges that I've talked about, whether they're climate, whether they are deterrence, whether they are healthcare, and this all issue is a challenge to leaders out there across the world. We need to lead in partnership. And so these are problems that are bigger than any one of our organizations. I'm all about, a competitive market-driven system, but let's also find those places where we can work together across industry, across government, across our innovation ecosystem to get after these really hard problems.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Where can people find out more about you, Keoki?
www.mitre, that's mitre.org, mitre.org. Thank you, Charles. Really enjoyed the chance to talk with you.